What it do, what it do. All right, ladies and gentlemen and D4 players, I hope you all had a Merry Christmas. All right, I know I sure did, but we've been hopping right back into the action. The World Rapid Chess Championship has been underway. We just finished covering day one live here on the Twitch and TikTok channel over at General Zod Chess. Day two is going to be December 27th, 5 a.m. Central, if you guys want to follow along the action. All right, we're doing this YouTube video to recap some of the games that I covered in day one, so that those who weren't able to see it live can still get aware of the action. All right. We had some brilliant games being played all over today. I was, the sole commentator for my stream. So because of that, I mostly focus on the top boards. So that's the ones that I'm going to be focusing on today. I love commentating, bringing the hype, bringing the action, and most importantly, showcasing all these players' elite talents for you guys. But I will say it is a very draining experience. All right. I was just doing it solo for 7 hours straight. So if I'm a little tired in this video, apologies, man, but this needs to be shown. All right. So the three games that I'm going to be focusing on today are the ones that I showed on stream, Magnus Carlsen's games. There were 5 rounds played today. I picked the 3 games that I liked the most. Although the third game is more about Magnus' opponent, more so than Magnus play himself, right? But it's because it's against Magnus that it's such a beautiful game. So we open with round 2. David Paravyan playing against Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces, both grandmasters, obviously. One of the only 2,000 of their kind alive and active in the world. Paravyan opens with e4, best bot test. Love to see him repping it. All right. Magnus opens with the Sicilian defense. The opening that is used the most at the high level when you want to play for a win with the black pieces against e4. It doesn't mean it's the only opening, but it gives you the best chances of getting a win. Sometimes you don't, but hey. So we get an open Sicilian with knight to c3. And now after pawn to e6, d4. I'm sorry, it's a closed Sicilian, and then it transposes to an open Sicilian. Kind of a Taimanov. And I gotta say, if you haven't been able to pick up over these last 5 seconds, I am not familiar with Sicilian structures at all. All right. When I was like 8 years old, my brother and I would play online chess, and my older brother would always resign on move 2 whenever he saw the Sicilian defense. So it's never been very popular in my family. But I understand maneuvers like queen c7, and after bishop e2, knight f6, knight b5, it looks like white is putting a lot of pressure on the black position. And after queen b8, you might ask, why did black just retreat his queen back to b8? This makes no sense, right? Why would you develop a piece and then undevelop it? The reason is you're trying to target the square on d6, making sure white never has control of it. Squares, when you're trying to make sure you have control of a square, that basically means you can place a piece there without your opponent being able to capture it, or your opponent can't place a piece there without that piece getting captured. So if the queen was on d8 still, white could go knight to d6, and black could capture on d6, but then the queen could jump down and capture, and this knight is not as valuable in the bishop because of all the dark squares in the position. So after pawn to f4 for Paravyan, maybe hinting at an eventual e5, right? It's pretty logical for Magnus to play pawn to d6, making sure that the knight can never get to d6, stopping pawn e5 in the central progression. But Paravyan is okay with this. Bishop to e3, developing his last minor piece. And you'll notice that because Magnus took time out to play queen d8, c7, b8, now he has both of his bishops undeveloped, while Paravyan's bishops are completely developed, and he has control of the center. So you might ask yourself, okay, well, shouldn't white just be completely lost? Not exactly. White started the game on offense and has his pieces ready to go, but black has a very solid position with no weaknesses to speak of except for the pawn on d6. But after bishop to e7, pawn to g4, a very aggressive move from Paravyan, right? Pawn to a6 comes from Magnus, and now after knight to d4, you'll notice the time control for this world championship is 15 minutes per side, with 10 seconds gained per move. Paravyan has basically used up none of his time, while Magnus is 3 minutes into the think tank at this point, which is still plenty of time on the ticker, but he has used a reasonable amount of time to achieve this position. And this is what makes Magnus so dangerous, right? Everyone at the grandmaster level, I think the casual player might think like, 2,500 grandmasters are nothing compared to a super grandmaster. Grandmasters don't really have like weaknesses or holes you can like poke at in their game. That's why they're grandmasters. So the way Magnus and other super grandmasters go about gaining advantages against them is by playing suboptimal moves. Here, the best move in the position for black, and what Paryarvan is undoubtedly expecting, is to play pawn to e5. But you have to understand when you're playing a game of chess, there are two people, right? There's Pinocchio and there's Geppetto, a puppet and a puppet master. And if you aren't the one pulling the strings, all right, you're the one getting strung along. So if you play into your opponent's hands and play the best optimal move, the move that he's ready for with pawn to e5, then after knight to f5, the game would still continue, but Paryarvan would still be deep into his preparation and would understand what he needed to do. Magnus kind of realizes my opponent's playing quickly. I want to play a move that he's unexpected or unprepared for. And because this is move 11, already a lot of moves have been played, Magnus finds the unusual knight takes d4. And this follows a common theme in the chess universe. When you have less space, right? And space is defined by which side has pawns further up the board. We see white's pawns controlling far more squares in black's side of the board than anything black's. I think black's controlling one square on white's side of the board with this knight, right? So clearly white's in the offensive. So when you have less squares, less space, you trade off pieces because that gives you more room to maneuver. And sometimes your opponents have less things to defend all their overextended pawns with. After queen takes d4, look at the thing Paryarvan had here. He ended up using a third of his eventual time. So while knight takes d4 isn't the best computer move, clearly it was the best move Magnus could make because it put Paryarvan out of what he was familiar with and into unknown territory. Now, the drawback is that this does give white a decisive advantage, not decisive advantage, but a slight pull in the position, right? Something for him to grapple onto. But it's still going to be tough to convert that into a concrete advantage where Magnus can say, okay, now I'm losing. Magnus immediately strikes back for the center of the board with pawn to e5, and after the queen retreats to d2, trying to maintain a battery on f4 to help out with any potential captures that might be needed. It's at this point in the position that Magnus plays knight takes on g4. Now he's up a pawn in the position, but his queen, rook, and kingside rook are all on the back rank, as well as the bishop, which has yet to move a square this game. And because of that, it seems like white's going to be okay and get his pawn back and maybe more with an eventual attack. Bishop takes g4 because you don't want to allow the dark square bishop to be traded off. Black is going to try his best to get this dark square bishop off the board. White wants to keep it. And now after bishop takes c8, Zod, you just said white wants to keep the dark square bishop on the board. What is Paryarvan doing? It's because Paryarvan saw this intermediate move, and Magnus saw it as well. And this is why chess is so interesting at this level, right? The player's intuition is both firing off here, but they don't have enough time to truly see every possibility. So it really is a mixture of my ideas versus your ideas, intuition, and the calculation that they're able to attain. So after Magnus captures the dark square bishop, instead of capturing on c8, because if you capture on c8, you're just down a minor piece, right? It looks like after queen captures back on e3, Magnus is going to be up a pawn. But this is why Paryarvan played the move. He saw bishop to d7. And now, if the king flees to the king side, white is just going to be up a piece. So the only option for Magnus is to capture on d7. Paryarvan captures on e3. And even though David is down a pawn, it looks like this black king in the center of the board is going to be under insane pressure. I mean, if you just take a look at this position, right, you don't have an evaluation bar sitting next to you. You have no idea what's going on. In the heat of the moment, right, the heat of battle, this is insanely hard to navigate. White has knight to d5, queen to h3. It's looking like the pressure could be upped on the d file by a rook, right? And all of your pieces, major pieces, are on their back rank or on their initial starting square. I don't even know what the queen on b8 is doing, but you're up a pawn, you know? So Magnus' idea and the war of ideas that's going on here is black is saying, listen, it looks scary, I'm inactive, but what do you actually have? The proof is in the pudding, right? If you don't have anything, I'm just up a pawn. So bishop h4 by Magnus, which he definitely saw leading into this line. And now after bishop h4, white's king can also no longer castle. But white says, okay, my king can't castle, big deal. I'm still clearly the one on the offensive because my rooks can activate much, much faster than black's immobile rooks. And now after bishop to f6, it looks like Magnus is in supreme trouble because knight to f6 would double your pawns, and then knight to b6 is just a fork on the king and the rook. So how does Magnus react in this position? How does he defend against the fork and the double up the pawns both at once? He ignores them both. He ignores them both. Oh my days. All right, the amount of nerves and resolve it takes to play Rookie 8 in a world championship format. Every game, every point matters so much at this level, at this tournament, and you're willing to hang the exchange. But you also have to keep in mind that these value systems that we assign to chess pieces is not it's subject to change, right? A knight is not always going to be worth 3 points of material, just like a rook isn't always going to be worth 5 points of material. Paryarvan sees the fork and he's like, okay, and Magnus puts his king on the 6th rank of the chessboard with 5 minutes left on his clock. Do not try this at home, all right? It will get you checkmated before move 20, but when you're a super grandmaster, you're allowed to break whatever rule you want. After king to c6, Paryarvan kind of realizes that if I capture the rook with my knight, and Magnus captures back, queen takes a8, then all of a sudden everything on the e file, this rook e8 move by Magnus, not bothering to move his bishop or his rook to defend against the fork, all of a sudden leaves Magnus with ton, a ton of pressure on the e file. And from a human standpoint, it's not easy to navigate. So Paryarvan says, okay, I'll just play a defensive move with pawn to c3, and I'll still be able to pick this rook off if I want. You're still passive. You need to do something. And now it's like, what does Magnus do? Rook is still under attack. You know, you can't play pawn to d5 because of knight takes d5. You could play queen a7, but then he can just take the rook down here, and it's like, why did you even do that? And in this position, with his king on the 6th rank of the chessboard, Magnus Carlsen finds bishop to g5, offering to sacrifice a bishop while his rook is hanging. It is a thing of beauty, and I cannot understand why this wasn't awarded a brilliant. All right. After bishop to g5, the idea is simple. If you move the queen to, let's say, c3, anywhere off of the b1, a7 diagonal, the knight on b6 falls. If you capture the rook on a8, you just lose a queen. If the queen moves to like f2 or g1, then the pawn on e4 falls. All of a sudden, Paryarvan is faced with a very, very difficult choice. And something you always have to be careful of in chess when you're trying to be the attacker is that the hunter can become the hunted very, very, very quickly. After queen takes g5, king takes g6, right? Queen takes g5 basically forced. Now it's Paryarvan's king who all of a sudden is in some potential danger staring down this e-file. But you say, okay, no big deal. I play queen to g1, a gorgeous move from Paryarvan, making sure that Magnus king can never slink away to that little corner on a7 behind his pawns, right? And now after king back to c7, king to d3 by Paryarvan. And this is so fascinating. Look at this position. Every single major piece on the board is on their first rank. After king to d3, Magnus plays pawn to g6, and this is a defensive move stopping white from playing queen takes g7. It's still very funny looking that he hasn't moved his queen or his rooks, but there's actually no reason to, despite appearances. The position is actually pretty dry for both sides. Neither king is on an open file, and it's going to be difficult to open it up. But if you can't, remember, in order to survive all of this uncomfortable attack pressure from white, Magnus has an extra pawn. So if it goes to an endgame, Paryarvan is in trouble. So Paryarvan needs to make something happen sooner rather than later, or else these pawns, everything that I highlight here is going to get traded off at some point, and this 3-1 majority is going to win in an endgame 100 times out of 100 with rook and pawn versus rook and 3 pawns, right? It's always going to be a win. Paryarvan knows that. He's under 30 seconds on the ticker, has to play on and create complications in the position. Rook to f6, a very nice move, creating pressure on both d6 and f7. And after queen to e8, queen to d4, defending both the pawn on e4 and threatening the pawn on d6. You have queen back to b4 by Magnus, and now the pawn on b2 and the king is under check at the same time, and all of a sudden no one has any idea what's going on here. Threats are being made, the pawn on c4, a dynamite play from white, and now Paryarvan attacks the queen on b5 while simultaneously attacking the pawn on d6. Magnus defends the queen while simultaneously offering the trade, while simultaneously defending the pawn on d6. The best moves in chess are usually the ones that solve two birds, one stone, and in this case, he's taking out like a whole nest per move. And now after rook hf1 with under a minute left on the ticker, Magnus greedily grabs a pawn. He says, listen, if I can get these 2 pawns and the queen's off the board, I'm always going to win this in-game now, because 2 protected passers are basically an unstoppable win condition in a rook in-game. So the only way Paryarvan can win this game, or even not lose, is to force some pressure against the king. So because of this, instead of going after the pawn on f7, Paryarvan immediately plays pawn to c5 in order to try and create more chaos in the position. Both sides under a minute on the ticker. Magnus responds with the only move to keep the advantage, rook to d8, defending against the pawn, right? Instead of being like Hikaru, because, none of us are super grandmasters, you don't have to say takes, right, to figure out what happens. You just count the number of attackers and number of defenders. White has 1, 2, 3 attackers on the pawn. Black has 1, 2, 3 defenders of the pawn. You always need more attackers than you have defenders in order to capture something. So we know white can't capture that pawn while winning. And if he does capture the pawn, right, what happens is all the rooks, queens come off the board thanks to the pin. And black is going to win that in-game thanks to these 2 passers. So because of that, Paryarvan plays the only move in the position that keeps him alive. Pawn to c6, but now in this position, Magnus Carlsen with under 50 seconds left plays a mind breaker. If you capture this pawn back with b7, it would never happen because you hang a rook immediately and you're losing. But it's not easy to figure out what to deal with, right? If you play a move like pawn to b6, then white can still capture on f7. So you can't capture the pawn. Oops. Oh no, I just spoiled it, all right? Instead, Magnus played pawn to d5. I apologize for the spoiler, chat, all right? And after pawn to d5, pawn takes back on d5 is a blunder, but I was covering this live, all right? I have no idea what you're supposed to play here as Paryarvan. Like, if this problem faced me in a real game, let alone a world championship setting with under 20 seconds on the clock, I would fold so quickly. It's not even close. I mean, my queen, king are both on the 3rd rank. I can't retreat my king anywhere because my opponent's queen is cutting me off. There's a discover check that also wins my queen on the way. It is such a difficult position to maneuver around. And I'm also already down 2 pawns. So it's not like practical to play pawn to e5, the best move in the position, because then you just get queen takes e5 and black is up 3 pawns. How do you survive this endgame? The computer evaluation bar says it's survivable for white, but you have less than 30 seconds left. You can't even fathom that being survivable. You need multiple minutes. So this pawn takes on d5 move by Paryarvan was played with like 2 seconds on the clock. I don't blame him for making the move, but now it's just forced mate after queen to d2, king to c3, and after rook to d3. This was one of the funniest moments from day 1 of the tournament. Paryarvan has to play queen takes e3, and the game is over because, you just take back and you have a queen and rook versus rook and rook. But Paryarvan ended up playing king to b4, thinking, okay, now I'm perfectly safe, and was visibly taken aback when queen to b5 came crashing down like a thunderbolt, and checkmate occurred in the position. It's not often that a grandmaster is surprised by checkmate. Part of it was due to time pressure, moving with not much time on the clock, but it was a very impressive display by Magnus in order to realize this extra pawn advantage he had. And while I thought it was impressive, a depressive defensive performance from Magnus. This next game, to be frank, kind of puts that to shame. All right. This is from round 4 of the tournament, the second last round of the day. Magnus Carlsen going up against David Anton, and David opens with the ready. Magnus was playing against a couple Spanish Spaniard grandmasters today. All right. After knight to f3, he gets the ready opening. Knight to f6, pawn to b3, and now pawn to d6. We get these hyper modern openings a lot more often at the grandmaster level than we used to. And the idea behind them is generally that you get a very safe, solid structure where you're not so much playing on for the win early at the start of the game, but you're getting a solid formation, and then you can either outmaneuver your opponent or find little intricacies that give you small advantages that build up to something larger down the line rather than going for a win immediately. Pawn to d4 in the position, pawn to g6, bishop to b2, simply developing on both sides, pawn to g3, the double fianchetto by David, and now the first surprising move of the game, pawn to b5. After bishop to g2, bishop b7, it's still, a normal game of chess, right? Both sides playing picture perfect. This is all theory for them, something they've encountered multiple times before. Although I should probably mention chess is such a vast sea that I think people see players' ratings and they're like, oh, this guy and this guy are like equal. They think like the same. But it's basically their culmination of knowledge results in their rating being what it is, right? It doesn't mean the two are the same strength or that they share the same strengths and weaknesses or even same ideas in the position. So a lot of times when these super grandmasters are taking time to think at the start of the game, it's more so about choosing which direction you want to try to take the game in, which is going to be most complicated for your opponent, because most of them have done this dance before. Pawn to a6, defending the pawn on b5 by Magnus. Castles by white, knight b to d7, because you don't want to go knight c6, keeping the diagonal for the light square bishop open. And now, after this retreating move, I don't want to say a bad idea by white, but white starts the game on offense because white goes first. I think it's kind of misleading to say that white starts the game with the advantage, because if white starts the game with the advantage, that should mean if you play perfectly as white, you should always win. But we haven't really seen that yet. There's actually, interestingly, some computer engine databases where sometimes that is the case, but it's not anywhere close to being a confirmed thing at this point. So when white begins the game on offense, before black can try to be better and win the game, black has to neutralize the position, or also known as equalize the position, right? And then after he equalizes the position, either side can play for the offense or the defensive, right? It's strictly up to the player. But one of the most awkward pieces in this kind of setup for black is his light square bishop, and he doesn't really have anywhere good to put it. So knight to d2 is definitely not a blunder by Anton, who, by the way, is playing some fantastic chess in this tournament, and I definitely have to keep an eye on. But while it isn't a blunder, it does allow black to equalize the position, right? You see the evaluation bar, negative 0.2 for black. It's basically equal. But this is about to be one of the greatest sequences you may ever see in a chess game, ever, all right? Pawn to c4 by white. Pawn to e5 by black. Pawn takes on b5. Pawn takes on d4. And now after bishop takes on d4, Magnus captures back on b5. And now Anton captures back on b5. And you're like, wait, what just happened? Magnus is down a pawn. Why did he do that? What compensation does black possibly have? I want you to pause this video and ask yourself how black can possibly have any kind of compensation for being down a pawn. Try and figure it out just from a human element, right? It is not an easy thing to do. After queen takes on b5, okay, you have pawn to c5, and it's like, okay, the dark square bishop has to retreat. Okay, we get that. We understand that. Now what, right? It looks like white's position is completely devoid of any weaknesses whatsoever. He is behind in development, because you have to understand that when you capture material in chess, unless it's a blunder by your opponent, right? Usually if it's material that you capture because you have an advantage in the position or you're able to pinpoint a weakness, when you capture material, your pieces are going onto squares that they normally do not belong on. They are not their strongest on. The queen on d3 is a much stronger piece in the center of the board, able to support e4, the king side if need be, also hitting the queen side, than the queen on b5 is. So when you try to capture material, and this is not a knock on playing queen takes b5, I don't think it's a bad move, but when you capture material too quickly sometimes, it can lead your pieces out of position, and your opponent can use that momentum against you. And so, in order to recognize or have that material advantage be realized, you're going to have to suffer for a while on the defensive. Anton definitely understood that when he captured, but you can't be scared of the boogeyman when you play chess. You can't be scared of something you don't see, right? If you don't see the danger, then you shouldn't react like there's danger. If there is danger, be smart. Knight to c3 comes in the position, and it looks like Anton is completely finished development here, right? After knight to c3, all of white's rooks are connected. All of his pieces are developed in the game, and we still have yet to see anything of substance for the black pieces. And I'm so jealous that I can't peer into the minds of these players and wonder what was going through their heads. After rook to b8, queen to a4, I need to know if Anton thought he was in trouble. Like, when chess players are making moves, they should have an evaluation of the position in their head. We're not stockfish, so the evaluation is sometimes wrong, but these guys are grandmasters for a reason, right? The way they evaluate positions is a large reason why they are at the level they're at. So I wonder what was going through David's head here. Did he think this position was winning for black? I know I saw this game live and I was like, this is winning? What? Queen a4 looks normal to me. White had to play queen a6 after black played rook to b8. And now after pawn to d4 comes in the position, knight to e4, and look at this. Knight takes e4, knight takes e4, rook to e8, and all of a sudden white's like, uh-oh, I can't go knight c3 or I lose the knight. But if I go knight back to d2, rook takes e2. If I go pawn f3, he's got f5. What just happened? And now after pawn f3, look at this. Magnus doesn't even play pawn f5. He plays knight b6. Because if you play pawn f5 too quickly, all of a sudden white's back in the driver's seat, right? This is something you always have to be careful of in chess, the hunter becoming the hunted, right? When you act too aggressively, sometimes it opens up pathways against your king that your opponent can then spring back on the offensive with. So instead, Magnus plays knight to b6, eliminating the c4 square from Her Majesty. Queen to a5 comes into the position, and now pawn to c4. What a dynamite play by Magnus. If you try and pick up this pawn on d4 with like rook a to d1, then knight to d5 is going to fork you for all you've got, all right? There's nothing you can do to stop it. Let's say you procrastinate with like bishop c1, if queen takes d8, then knight to e3, and you're getting forked, right? Bishop c1, queen takes a5. If white plays something like, let's say, king to h1, now pawn to f5 comes in crashing down the position like a thunderbolt in the night sky, right? So this position is already insanely difficult for Paravyan to survive. And again, I have no idea where the danger happened. I mean, this is one of the most brutal, rapid takedowns I have ever seen, because I genuinely have no idea when this game got out of hand, right? It was just white's up a pawn and all of a sudden white's losing. It's just, I have no idea what happened. I can't even begin to explain it. And all of a sudden the queen is under attack, the bishop's under attack, a fork on e3, right? And after queen takes on d8, you would think Magnus plays knight to e3 going for the fork, but nope, he just plays rook takes d8 first, and the bishop is still under attack. This is straight suffering from Paravyan. And now, finally, after bishop to c1, pawn to f5 comes crashing down in the position and forcing the knight to retreat to f2. If it goes to d2, you're just going to lose more material. But after knight to d2, rook takes e2, rook to d1, trying to hold on for all he's got. It's just too little, too late. Pawn d3, you can't capture on d3 anyway because of the pin. The rook is under attack, only one square to go to. But after rook b1, pawn to d2, knight to e3 is under threat here. A disgusting takedown. Again, by Magnus going up against David in this game, coming into the game, and then even after this game and this round, Anton has been playing some magnificent chess. I believe he's still in the top 20 for this event right now, going into day 2 of the tournament. He just encountered a monster. All right. Trying to survive with king to f1, and you can take your pick of how to win here, but Magnus, being Magnus, picks the most accurate, and he plays rd to e8, after which Anton is forced to resign. This dark square bishop has no escape squares. b2 is covered by the knight and the bishop. If you go to a3, pick it up with the pony, you capture on d2, well, then I fork you, right? Oh, this is one of the most brutal takedowns I have ever seen. All right, this game, for me, was the highlight of the day. Just insane technical skill from Magnus. But while the other 2 games were surgical takedowns by Magnus, I thought this game, quality-wise, is one of the greatest rapid games you're ever going to see, right? It was the last game of the day, round 5. Round 6 is going to, once again, take place tomorrow, 5 a.m., right? Well, if you're watching this video the night I upload it. If you're not and you're watching the future, all right, stay tuned for more. But day 2 resumes, round 6 resumes 5 a.m. Central tomorrow, December 27th. And then Arjun Erigaisi and Magnus Carlsen were the only 2 undefeated players going into the last round of the day, round 5. Going into this game, both had an undefeated score of 4 out of 4. And it was up to Magnus with the white pieces to try and press on and claim that perfect score, taking sole possession of the tournament. Arjun knew what was going on heading into the game and was insanely well prepped. Technically, they played in English, but it transposed, like, you can't really call this in English. It transposes into a QGD, Queen's Gambit Decline, quite quickly. And Magnus gets the dark square bishop out of the pawn chain before playing pawn to e3. Arjun replicates it, getting his dark square bishop outside of his pawn chain before playing pawn to c5, the more aggressive of the 2 approaches. Now, the downside of this is after pawn takes on d5, pawn takes on d5, pawn takes on c5, and now instead of the immediate recapture queen to a5, what white has managed to do here is give black the IQP, isolated queen's pawn, and grandmasters love creating permanent weaknesses in your opponent's position, right? A temporary weakness in chess is like this light square bishop. It's clearly not good. It's not even a fat pawn. A pawn could at least legally move a square or 2 up. It's blocking its own rook. It can't legally move a single square, but you know, the chess game's going to happen. This knight's going to move. This bishop's going to have a life. But no matter what moves are made here, this pawn on d5 is never going to have a pawn on c6 or a pawn on e6 capable of defending it. That means instead of having to focus all of your attention on the pawn immediately as white, you can develop your pieces, set everything up, and then after you have a solid position, you can target this pawn and try and put pressure on it. So that's Magnus's game plan here. We see Arjun also play queen to a5, right, going after the knight on c3. And this is a really interesting move, knight to d2 by Magnus. You'll notice the time differential by both sides, 15 minutes by Arjun, 11 for Magnus. And now I think knight to d2 was the first move where Magnus was out, or sorry, Arjun was out of the prep that he had prepared for Magnus. He'd been blitzing out moves up to this point. And one of the most impressive things about the young Indian prodigy, Arjun, is his speed and his accuracy that he's able to play at while he's defending positions. His strength is 1000% his aggression and his ability to attack, but he is also an elite world-class defender, and that is the sole reason that I chose this game. It is one of the greatest defensive performances that you're ever going to see in a non-classical chess game. There are a single-digit list of players that could have managed a draw in this game, and Arjun displays some insanely phenomenal technique. Every single piece comes off the board here. I kind of skipped over this little sequence. After bishop takes c3, pawn takes c3, queen takes c3, you ask why Magnus would hang the pawn on c3, and the reason for that is he's saying pick your poison. You can have c3 or c5, but not both, right? So after bishop takes on f6, knight takes on f6, bishop to b5, bishop d7, rook c1, queen a5, bishop d7, knight d7, king castles. You have this resulting position where all the bishops got traded off as long as a pair of ponies. And White still has this isolated queen's pawn to play against. But on the other hand, Arjun has this weak pawn on c5 and this 2-to-1 majority on the queen side. So it looks like he's doing a-okay out of the opening. Knight takes c5, and now instead of going after the pawn on d5 immediately, Magnus forces the pair of ponies off the board, helping his queen develop and connect his rooks, completing White's development, while Black still has to castle his king. Right? You don't want to leave your king in the center of the board. If you try and hold on to the pawn with like pawn to b6, then White's just going to play rfd1, and he's going to get his pawn back somehow, some way. So instead, Arjun castles, and now queen takes b7 comes into the position. Arjun captures on a2, rook to a1, queen c4, exchange on a7, and now whenever there's an isolated pawn, what matters isn't putting pressure on the square the pawn is on itself. It's always about the square in front of the pawn. If the square in front of the pawn is controlled by the side that's attacking it, then the pawn usually becomes a weakness. If the pawn is able to advance and isn't controlled, meaning it can advance without being taken out, then that pawn can often expand and sometimes become a passer or a win condition in the game for you. So here, Magnus controls the square on d4, 2 attackers versus 1 defender of the d4 square. Getting his rook out to c8, and now pawn to h3, pawn h6, providing a luft for both sides, right? So there's no back rank checkmates. Rook to d1 by White, queen to e2. And now this is some pretty, like, it goes underrated in this game. It's kind of like overshadowed because of how long this game goes. But Magnus plays some nice queen maneuvers in order to figure out some way of capturing this pawn on d5. Look at this. Rook a1, lining the queen and the rook up at the same time. Queen to b2, just keeping an eye on the rook. Rook to f1, making sure the queen can't keep an eye on the rook. King to g7, making sure there's no back rank checks with the queen, should the rook ever leave. Queen to a5, going after the pawn. If you push the pawn here, there's queen to e5, check, and you pick up the pawn. So queen to b3. Now queen to d2. White would have loved to play rook to d1 last move, but if he played rook to d1 last move, then, you lose a rook. So queen to d2 to support that, queen to c4, rook to d1, and now Arjun doesn't bother defending this pawn. He plays pawn to h5, and Magnus doesn't capture the pawn. He plays pawn to g3. Basically, both sides have recognized that this pawn on d5 is going to fall, but they also have played enough chess and studied their in-games, like you guys need to, that they know this 4-3 majority with the kings on both sides of the board should always be a draw with perfect play. And the most underrated part about this position is that Arjun has achieved a drawable position against Magnus Carlsen with the black pieces while playing extraordinarily quickly. When you're pressed up against the clock, oftentimes you're going to be in a position where you have to think your way out of it, and thinking obviously burns time, it burns stamina. One of the most impressive displays of mental stamina and mental energy in a non-classical game that I personally have seen over these last few months from Arjun in this game. Queen to b7. Magnus recognizes at this point that if the queens come off the board, it's still going to be a draw. So instead of immediately ushering the game into that stage, he pokes and prods, sees if his opponent will produce any weaknesses, if there's anything you can play for, right? You always got to make your opponent prove it. You don't want to say, okay, I do X and he does Y and it's a draw. You make them find the move. Always make your opponent find the move. Unless it's a move that, like, if it's an all or nothing move, expect them to find the all. Don't play hope chess. But you try and keep the position the same. And we're going to see Magnus take that to the nth degree later on in this game, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much. So it transposes to a rook and pawning game. Now it's a 4-3 majority. Whenever you have a 4-3 majority, the general rule of thumb is if you're the side playing on offense, you want to avoid allowing it to be a 3 versus 2 majority. Those are much easier to draw than a 4 versus 3 majority. So Magnus does his best to keep all the pawns on the board. Arjun tries to keep the king at bay or trade off one set of pawns, making the draw much, much easier for black. Although both players at this point understand in their heads that it is a draw with perfect play. But humans are known to not really be perfect, Even elite humans are still capable of blunders, although Arjun Erigaisi might be something more than an elite human, let me tell you. All right, pawn to h4 by Magnus. Look at him massage this position. This is what he's known for. Grinding water from a stone, being able to take these positions that are drawn in games and grind out wins over a long course of time. He gets the little bathtub formation of pawns, h4, g3, f3, and e4. And now after rook to f2, pawn to e5 by by Magnus, with Arjun keeping his rook completely trained on everything that he can, making sure his king doesn't get pushed back too far. And now, after a bunch of rook maneuvers, it looks like Arjun has the draw all locked up. Because how do you possibly advance here if you're white? It looks like everything is completely locked up, and the players are going to repeat by a draw, except Magnus plays rook f6. Okay, rook f6, no big deal. Just play rook h2, prevent g4. Okay, king g5. It's a little weird looking, but okay, rook g2. Now you got to go back, Magnus, right? Because if you don't go back, you just lose the g3 pawn. And if you go pawn g4, remember, it becomes 3 versus 2, which is a lot easier to draw. So instead, king to h6. And this is one of the craziest moves of the day, because after king h6, Magnus just voluntarily gives up the pawn on g3. And a pawn is a pawn is a pawn. Arjun captures it. With under 20 seconds left, Magnus detected this insane trap. He realized that after pawn f4, he could start sneaking his king into g7. And if you allow king to g7 as black, for example, rook to g4 going after this pawn, king g7, rook takes h4, rook takes f7, the king retreats, but now this pawn is too much. You're going to lose the pawn on g6, and these two protected passers run down the board. So Arjun, with a minute left on the clock, recognizes that he's in danger and finds the only drawing sequence in the game. Look at this. Look at this. King f8, right? And it's like, okay, king f8, I can get behind that, right? It's still a pretty nice move because, you know, you have to retreat instead of attack. But now, pawn g6. How do you defend the f7 pawn? Oh no, you're going to lose a pawn. Nope. King back to e7. And now Magnus being Magnus, he captures on f7. You take the free rook. Not good. Not a good look. But guess what? We just go back king to f8. We just go back. We go back, and you can't promote. You still can't get in, and you can't promote. I should mention that if you play king to g7 here, now black can play f takes on e6. And there's no way for white to win this in game. Even if you play rook takes on g6, black now has rook to g4. And the idea is if you take, I think it's losing because black gets a queen faster. If you don't take, I just capture the pawn on h4. So, disgusting technique here by Arjun. Also disgusting technique from Magnus even to push this game further. Okay, rook takes g6, and now how does Arjun defend this position? It looks like if you capture on g6, it's just going to be a losing king and pawn in game. Rook to h3, going after the pawn on h4. And now it looks like you lose the pawn on h5. And look at Magnus, king to g5. This is the technique that Arjun has at this level with under a minute left on his clock, playing in round 5, the 5th game of the day, against the strongest chess player in the world. On move 60, he understands that even though black is down 2 pawns, that he's able to maintain and hold the draw. This is why you study the endgame, because you need to know these things. You need to already know this is going to be a draw if I can set this position up. With a minute left on the clock, there's too many possibilities for you to consider, for you to just be able to come up with it on the spot. You have to know how to draw, and you have to be impeccable in your defense here, all right? And now we're on move 63 of this chess game. Magnus Carlsen goes up 2 pawns, but with the king in control of the f-pawn's queening square, and this h-pawn, you know, it's about as useless. It's about as useful as a umbrella in the Sahara, all right? Let me tell you, h-pawn, rook in games, king to g4, and we get the maneuvering battle of the century here, all right? I have no real words to commentate this. The rooks start hopping to and fro. Look at Arjun, though. On move 70, he finds the only move to once again hold the position. I mean, this one's kind of obvious, you know, rook g1, you want to force the king away. We get that. We understand that. We know that. But still, move 70 against the world's strongest player, being able to hold that mental stamina, that mental energy, the mental fortitude it takes to pull that off, let alone the stakes of the tournament, playing for first place going into day 2 of the World Rapid Championship, you know. The pressure is on here for Arjun. But after rook to e6, rook to h1, right? Magnus slowly but surely realizes there's nothing that can be done because this man's technique, move 74, he's played 73 moves to perfection, and if he makes a mistake here on move 74, if he moves his king to g8 or h8, it is game over on the spot because of pawn h5, rook takes h5, and then king g6. With the idea being rook to e8 is checkmate if you move this rook out of the way. Arjun sniffs out every trap in the position, passes with flying colors. Again, if you capture this, rook to h8 is checkmate on the spot. Look at this, chat. Oh my days. I mean, king to h6, once again, the only move that keeps the position a draw. If you go king back to f8, black is once again in trouble. You might be able to get away with king f8, although with the rook on the pinning the king to the back rank, you might be in trouble. King to h6, rook to e6, king h7, rook g1, king h5. Move 80 has been reached in this chess game. The accuracy for both players is 97.9%, a thing of beauty to behold. With only 15 minutes left on the clock, both players play accurate chess. Magnus realizes there's nothing more that can be done, right? I should mention that if you just push the pawns, black can just sit back with his king, wait for you to push, and then as soon as the pawn's on the 7th rank, the rook just comes down here and you check him forever. And that's why Magnus is delaying this pawn push as long as he humanly can. He's trying to force Arjun into a mistake. And Arjun is like, nah, I'll pass. Not that guy, right? Rook to a6. And finally, after 89 moves, this h-pawn enters the black side of the position. Rook to g1, king to f5, and we see Arjun maintain the perfect technique. Rook back to b1. Magnus does everything in his power to try and force some kind of counterplay that I want to say messes with Arjun, but like gives him indecisiveness. Arjun has never been down on time once in this game, and it is a thing of beauty to behold. After rook to g4, rook back to h1, rook to g5, king to f6. On move 95 of the chess game, Arjun finds the last defensive resource he needs to ensure that this is a draw. After king to f6, you understand why. Because now rook to h4. Magnus tried to be as sneaky as he could about it, but rook takes f4, rook to g6. And even though the king is cut off, Arjun simply finds rook to b4. And now, even after the pawn pushes, Arjun just plays rook to b8, king to b7, king to g7. And now, after rook to b7, a draw is agreed upon on move 101 of the chess game. All right, 97.9% accuracy. One of the greatest non-classical, one of the highest quality non-classical defensive performances I have ever seen. Big shout out to Arjun in this match. All right, both players are tied for the tournament lead, along with Gukesh, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, and a young player from India. All right, a young international master, Gautam, who has turned heads at this event. All right. And tomorrow for me, all right, we're going to be covering day 2 of the tournament live here on Twitch and on TikTok. Be on the lookout for that, all right? I appreciate the support, as always. Thank you guys so much. We just became eligible to get accepted into the YouTube partner program for monetization, and we just became a YouTube partner. Shout out to all of you guys making that possible. We also just hit 4K subscribers on YouTube. All right, I appreciate the support, man. The channel has been growing like crazy. It's all because of you guys helping push the channel, growing into something crazier than I could have even imagined. All right, so shout out to all of you guys. It's been a ton of fun as well doing all of this. I'm trying new stuff out every day, learning more and more about like the ins and outs of everything, you know. And it's been a blast, man. I'm enjoying it. All right. Hope you guys are along for the ride. All right. Thank you for making it this far with me. I appreciate the support. And as always, to end the video, remember, when the world is cruel, choose to be kind, baby. I will see you all in the next one. Until then, have a good one. All right.